Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can everyone hear me just fine?
Yes.
Fantastic. Welcome to Federal Hall. My name is Alexander Hamilton. 250 years ago, I was walking these streets, creating the great America that you enjoy today. And with that in mind, I wish you a glorious Independence Day. During this talk, I'd like to expand upon my time here in New York City, as well as the importance of this building and how I was instrumental in getting the most important acts passed through here, though I was actually not I was not part of Congress after the Constitution. But of course, I wielded great power and influenced most of the laws that were actually enacted, the good ones, I would say. My journey actually began when I was quite young. Coming here as a teenager, I enrolled in King's College, but the air of revolution was around us. And the other students at King's College, realizing that we were the fortunate ones that had enough money in order to go to college, figured that we would end up being part of the officer corps if a revolution did eventually come. And sure enough, after the battles of Lexington and Concord, a call was put out in New York State to create militias, of which the students at King's College created a uniformed militia corps called the Hearts of Oak. Now, it is not too long after I was training with the Hearts of Oak, practicing my drills, learning how to become a good soldier, that I saw General Washington for the very first time. He was on his way up to Boston from Philadelphia as he is just taking command of the army. Now, at this time, there were actually no battles in New York to speak of because the Redcoats were still here. And so as General Washington made his way to Boston and reviewed the troops here, it really was quite a surreal event. Because General Washington, in his grandiose stature, standing at 6'2", sitting upon his horse, reviewing us, the soldiers, standing in formation, with redcoats, standing in the distance, watching the whole affair. But they knew not to cause any problems because they were greatly outnumbered at that time here in New York City. After the general left and went on to Boston, we here in New York got the idea of confiscating the cannons down at the Battery. After doing so, I traded in my musket for a larger caliber gun, namely the cannon, and I challenged the exam to become captain of the artillery. My brigade, my regiment, was the only regiment that was not disbanded after the Revolutionary War, as we did not need a standing army. But having a standing corps of artillerymen was always a good idea. And so today, the longest lasting and only regiment from the Revolutionary War is my own regiment, which is the 1st Brigade, 5th Battalion Field Artillery. Now, it was soon that I was able to put those guns to practice. But in 1776, but first, when the British were sailing into New York Harbor, around this time, 248 years ago, another surreal event happened. As we were reading the Declaration of Independence for the first time on July 9th, 200 ships of the mast, of the line, came into sight into New York Harbor. This is the largest armada in the history of the world. It reminded me of my great Greek teachings of Thermopylae and Sicily. So 30,000 troops lay at our doorsteps. With this in sight, we proclaimed our independence from the strongest military on the planet. Now, I was actually in uniform at the time, so I could not partake in the revelries of my fellow Sons of Liberty as they then marched from the Common, which is around the City Hall today, and marched down Broadway in order to tear down the statue of King George, and also to cut off all of the royal emblems around the fence of Bowling Green. The fence still survives today, and you can still feel the cut marks So if you want to enjoy touching a little bit of the history that I touched as well, please do so. And then start to think about how you would feel knowing that 30,000 troops are coming here to quell your thirst for your rights. It really was quite a time of uncertainty. But soon we did put our cannons to the test, and unfortunately we failed. After the British invaded us in 1776, we proceeded to lose most of the battles here in New York, all of the battles, and then going over to New Jersey. And finally, by the end of the year in 76, we have lost all major battles, and we were on the other side of the Delaware River over in Pennsylvania. But thanks to the work and the ingenious efforts of our commander, George Washington, he provided an opportunity for us to strike back, namely at the British Reserve, the Hessian troops, in Princeton and in Trenton, right around Christmas and New Year's. I was able to put my cannons right down Queen Street in Trenton in order to help quell the Hessians from gathering themselves together from our surprise attack. The general noticed my endeavors, took me under his wing, and made me his aide-de-camp, which started a 22-year friendship that existed for the entirety of his life. Now, I was under his pen, really, for the entirety of the war, but my station in life was up to myself. For I was not born with money. I was not born with title. I was not even born with any type of noble family, though my grandfather was actually a Scottish lord. Unfortunately, my father was third in line, and according to the English law of the time, the entirety of an estate would go to the eldest son, and the second and third eldest son would go into law or to clergy or to the military. My father went to go find his fortune. He'd never found it. So I knew that the only way for me to raise in the ranks of New York society was to prove myself. And I endeavored to do so, but the general kept me at bay until the very last battle, the last major battle of the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Yorktown. In it, we provided a siege where we cornered the British, and this ended up being the second time that we were able to defeat the British in battle, capturing thousands of troops when we cornered Lord Cornwallis. And my brave endeavors were to secure Redoubt 10, the very last redoubt or fortification surrounding Yorktown. A redoubt is really just an earthenwork fort that is surrounded by pikes, and knowing that this was going to be a struggle, I ordered my men not to load their muskets, rather to fix bayonets. And under the cover of darkness, though under the cover of fire as well, we stormed the redoubt. Of the 200 British soldiers that were in there, we captured about 70 of them, after about 40 minutes of furious hand-to-hand combat. I led that charge, and now I've solidified my honor and bravery through my actions in the Revolutionary War. With that being accomplished, I had no more need of the military, and I resigned 2 weeks later to come back here to New York. In doing so, I challenged the bar exam. The bar exam they allowed me to challenge it, though I did not complete my schooling, because there was a great need of lawyers as we disbarred all of the Tory, or loyal to the king, lawyers. We don't want them arguing in court anymore. So I was able to challenge the exam. Another friend of mine at the time challenged the exam as well. We shared a great many things in common. Aaron Burr. Both of us were orphans. Both of us brought ourselves up to study law. Both of us were in the military. Both of us commended ourselves with great bravery. Only our personalities and our driving force differed. And that choice really, that schism really was a fateful one for me. But I did not know so at the time, as I still considered him a friend. Now, after I left, I also joined the Confederation Congress. You've probably heard of the Continental Congress. There was the First and Second Continental Congress, and they are the body that declared independence on July 4th. Once the Articles of Confederation were ratified in 1781, they changed to the Confederation Congress, but they actually didn't really change the name. We kept the same president, but it is a different form of government. It was more formal. The rules were every state had one vote. All decisions must be unanimous, and this great governing body, in order to fuel this revolution against the world empire, was given absolutely no power to raise money at all. That was a problem. As aide-de-camp to General Washington, my job was to constantly write to Congress asking for money, asking for food, asking for supplies that were necessary for the war effort, and we rarely got it. The Congress actually realized that their efforts were just simply not going to be up to snuff, and eventually they gave up that right to the states, asking the states simply to fund their own armies throughout the war. Once the war ended, we lost our common enemy, Great Britain. And what we were left with, this weak central government, did not help. Since we no longer had that common enemy, we tended to take care of ourselves. And it's important to realize that the United States of America at that time were not as united as you might have thought. We were really 13 different countries that had different cultures, sometimes even a different language, from a New York stock jobber to a Gloucester fisherman to a farmer down in North Carolina. It is hard to have a conversation between those two or three types of people. The great uncertainty of the war, where people got into war finance, they understood what was going on. Once the war ended, many of those people lost their contracts, many of those people lost their jobs, and so there was great uncertainty at that time. This uncertainty led to upheavals, even in the military. There were a couple of attempted mutinies, or at least vigorous discussions of discontent, I might say, throughout the army. But up in Newburgh, the officers were going to revolt. This is where the main army was encamped in 1782. General Washington kept them at bay, securing our part, the honor of the officers, telling them that they don't want to be remembered for this one action. Unfortunately, the general was not able to come down to quell the rebellion that happened with the soldiers in Philadelphia. But I have recently, in 1783, been elected to the Confederation Congress in Philadelphia, and this is the body that I was writing to the entire war. Finally, I'm able to see the people that have been ignoring all my pleas for help, and what happened was really, you might almost say it's fitting. We were routed out of Independence Hall, in a way, by about 400 Pennsylvania troops who demanded back pay. The governor of Pennsylvania at the time, realizing that he sided with the troops, decided not to send in the militia. And so we had to flee Independence Hall. We had to stop our Congress, stop the official proceedings of Congress, and leave. Doing so, we went to Trenton, we went to Annapolis, we went to Princeton, but while we were at those cities, we realized we need to have an actual permanent capital. Congress did make a law saying that the capital should be moved either to somewhere along the Rappahannock or on the Delaware River. But we did not decide exactly what place. Eventually, though, so with this being done, I did not serve out my full year term. I was only there for about 7 or 8 months, but after all of this mayhem, realizing that it is part of their actions that have caused this discontent with society, I did not feel that my value was best placed within that governing body, and I resigned to come back here to New York, where I put my endeavors to a much greater use. I created the Bank of New York, an ingenious financial institution for the banking system of Europe at the time was for businesses. Like the Bank of England could give loan to businesses, but not to people. As I wrote the Constitution for the Bank of New York, I made it a bank for the people. So anyone with good credit can apply for a loan. It ended up being the first company that had their stock publicly traded at the New York Stock Exchange a couple of years later on. It's actually quite interesting to note that I had a monopoly on the Bank of New York for about 15 years. My friend, Aaron Burr, was always trying to do what I did. And he wanted to create a bank. So he actually joined together with Mr. Chase in order to fill a need by creating a water company because the previous water company killed about 200 people because of poor water. So he raised about $2 million, put $100,000 into a water company, and the other $1,900,000 into the financial arm of this water company. And so when that water company went bust, because apparently its purpose was not to provide clean drinking water for the citizens, but rather to create a bank, I felt deceived by Aaron Burr, and that is when he became no longer a friend of mine. But his bank did continue, and today it is Chase Bank. The original offices for it are actually right next door, over at 40 Wall Street. In January of 1785, Congress eventually came here to settle into a semi-permanent location here in Federal Hall. They resided here until 1790. At that time, there was also, as we were realizing, a lot of the problems that we were having as independent countries or states, and dealing with all the issues that we used to rely upon Great Britain for, the states in the mid-Atlantic area started to work out some of their common borders, as well as some of their trading and tariff laws. This got us together into a larger formation at Annapolis in the following year, where we realized that the common goals of prosperity are best achieved through reasonable men coming together to solve these problems. That was the great acknowledgement that came out of the Annapolis Convention. When I came back to New York, I was in the New York legislature at the time, and they decided to go to Philadelphia for what is now called the Constitutional Convention. I was at a wee bit of a loss, for most of New York was controlled by Governor Clinton at the time, who was with the wealthy landowners up in New York. You can consider them to be anti-federalists. These are very strong people that basically had enough power that they did not want to share it. And so, realizing that of the three men sent down there, only I was a man for reason, and the other two were men for self-proclamation and self-security, I made an agreement with the Continental Congress at the time. And I asked them I told them that if we go and have this convention, and if New York sends its delegates, if I go, whatever we decide at this convention must be binding. It's not a recommendation, it must be binding. That little bit of difference gave us our country. Because once we went down to Philadelphia, we actually only had a mandate to change the Articles of Confederation, to augment them, to make them a little bit better. But what we ended up doing was simply erasing all of them. We scratched them out of existence. Now, whilst this is going on, there are still a tremendous amount of upheavals going on in the country. Lest you forget, every state had its own currency. Every state had a stronger government than the federal government. Every state declared its own tariffs for British trade. So it's very easy for one state to say, I'll charge a 6% tariff, and then the neighboring state to go for 5%, and the further state to simply say 3%. Great Britain realized this, and they played us off of each other to our detriment. So it was with sound mind that we realized a strong central government, which gives us the ability to unilaterally levy tariffs and duties as one united country, is a far better system. The remnants, though, of Shays' Rebellion in western Massachusetts really helps to put a personal figure on this. This was a rebellion that lasted for 8 months. And the reports of this highlighted and became an example of the discontent that was in society. Once we were finished writing the Constitution, to which I was a member of the Article of Style, though they really did not take in any of my recommendations. I was recommending that they, instead of having a president, that they have a governor who serves for life on good behavior. They called me a monarchist for this. But I was just realizing the truth that Great Britain had one of the greatest, if not the greatest system of government, albeit without the king, that Parliament has in the world. But my favoritism towards that sure quality of system of Parliament was to my demise, and it dogged me for the rest of my life, being called a monarchist and elitist. Here I am, a poor immigrant, mind you, the only founding father that does not come from a particular state. I was born in Nevis and then came up through St. Croix to New York, my adopted city. Once we came back from the convention, it was time to ratify the convention. Another ingenious idea that we had was to take the Constitution and not give it back to the state governments. They probably would not want to willingly give up power in favor of a national government, so we bypassed them. We went over their heads to the people. Hence the preamble of the U.S. Constitution, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union. We don't want to disparage what got us through the war. It worked. Not well, but it worked. We did defeat the world empire to create our fledgling country. But a more perfect union is what we needed. And so each state would have their own ratifying convention where the people would come together. But what are they voting on? They need to know. And so with my good friends here in New York, of John Jay, and a Virginian by the name of James Madison, who was actually up here in New York at the time, ended up being my good friend, I refer to as General, we wrote the Federalist Papers. We wrote it with pseudonym at the time, so nobody knew it was us, but we wrote 85 essays altogether, of which 51 I wrote. And they are basically explaining what the Constitution is, and they self-debate the ideas and qualities of the U.S. Constitution. Eventually, New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify, and became, with 9, the Constitution became valid, a living next form of government. At this time, New York actually did not yet vote, but we still had a celebration nonetheless. It was actually the greatest celebration that New York has ever had. Every citizen of New York basically went to our barbecue up on Banyard Hill, and there was even a 27-foot frigate placed on wagons called the Hamiltonian. And people were thinking about renaming New York City Hamiltonia or Hamiltonopolis. I was at the height of my popularity at this time. Life was really good. Now, there still were some things going on with the Confederation Congress or Continental Congress. I use those terms interchangeably, namely the Northwest Ordinance. And this was happening here in this building that they're meeting in from 85 until 90. The Northwest Ordinance provided a framework where territories to the north and west of the Ohio River can join the Union without allowing slavery. Thomas Jefferson wanted to have slavery up until 1800, but luckily we were able to keep that at bay. It has always been an issue that has dogged our country, and of course, eventually you had to figure it out without me. Quickly after New Hampshire, New York and Virginia ratified becoming 11. It's interesting to note that eventually, when George Washington took the oath of office to become our very first president, that he was the president of the 11 states of America, because Rhode Island and North Carolina have not yet ratified the Constitution. The last official meeting was held here in October of 1788. And then something happened which you'd very much be able to associate with. The building went under construction. It actually went from that version of building to that version of building. Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, a grand Frenchman who I knew from the war. He was a very talented artist, architect, and engineer. He helped to change the building, and of course, once the scaffolding goes up, the doors get closed, and Congress simply had to move. But there was nothing really going on for Congress at the time, as we were just ratifying the Constitution. And it wasn't until March 4th that the first Congress met here in Federal Hall under the new Constitution. And it was that upgrade by Pierre-Charles L'Enfant that changed the name from City Hall to Federal Hall. Make no qualms about it, when we named it Federal Hall, we were telling the government, telling Congress, by the way, this is your federal building, feel free to stay here, even though you thought that you're going to put it on the Rappahannock or the Delaware River. On April 30th, George Washington was inaugurated as the first president, and then September 11th, 1789, I was appointed as the Secretary of the Treasury. Finally, I can put all of my grand ideas to work. My ideas were simple: unleash the American potential. If you were born poor in Europe, you were going to die poor. That was a known. At the time, though, there was an interesting legal way to get yourself out of that guaranteed poverty by temporarily indenturing yourself as a voluntary indentured servant, where they would pay your way to come to the New World, and then you would put in your service to the person who owned you for 7, 10, or 12 years. And at the end of that time, you were granted your contract, which hopefully stipulated some land or money. Most of the time you got land because we had so much more of it. Now, this was the way to raise up your status in life. Mind you, 18th century life was one of, if you had the right to vote and I did not, when I'm in the Sunday market and walking through the market, I would have to lower my eyes to you just because you are a voting member of society. Your voice matters. Your voice carries a vote. And the way that we realize who has the wherewithal to vote, who do we want to trust to vote? Because seriously, have you been outside lately? Do you really want all of those people voting? You have to have some way to determine who can rationalize the best possible choice. Well, if you can own land, if you can make it that far in life and keep land or property, then you can vote. And so we kept that idea. So the American dream is that each individual can finally, for the first time in the millennia of their family, finally become a real member of society, one that opinion matters with the vote. Now, my economic plan was to help these people, to help domestic manufacturing. To do so, I would create a bank in order to help facilitate, as I mentioned before, the economic progress. And this would be done also through the laying of tariffs, of which the different states made a buckle of, in order to, and then basically to join us together through money. You see, at the very beginning, getting everyone on board with the federal idea was quite difficult. Because if you were born in New York, you were a New Yorker. That is who you are. The whole idea of being an American, that was not yet felt by everyone. It was a brand new idea. But since the wealthy elite of society lent money, those who were patriots, lent money to the cause, to the states were paying them back. But if I can take all that state debt and put it and collect it under the federal government and have the federal government pay them back, well, those rich gentlemen will look forward to their check from the federal government. They would want the federal government to succeed. They would want the federal government to guarantee and to be a reliable partner in trade and in credit. It is so important for our country to establish its credit. Now that our Constitution was ratified, the very first capital of the United States of America is here. In the first Congress, they had 3 sessions. The first 2 were here, the third was down in Philadelphia. Eventually, we moved the capital in 1790 from here to Philadelphia for a period of 10 years as they built this new city on the hill. Just like the Palatine Hills of Rome, we tried to find an area on one of our major waterways, and we found it, coincidentally, just up the river from Mount Vernon, George Washington's home on the Potomac. As far as you can possibly sail up the Potomac before you hit the falls at Jamestown. Georgetown. It is a fantastic area though, and we put on top of the hill the Capitol building. But that all has to be built. It is nothing more than farmland at this point when we are deciding this in 1790. Now, though I was not in the Congress, as I was eventually appointed to be Secretary of the Treasury, I'm always trying to put my plan into action through whatever laws are being created. And here are the list of all the laws that this building found fit to bestow upon our country. The very first law that we've ever made was simply to regulate the time and manner of administrating oaths, so other people can make more laws. But after that became the very next one, the Tariff of 1789. For the first time, our country can actually impose a tariff. And this is to protect domestic manufacturing. And I did it by weight instead of by product. I wanted to keep it simple. I didn't want to do it on value, because value can be speculative. Value can change, but weight is a determining factor. Weight will not change. So 50 cents per ton if you are foreign ship coming into port, and only 6 cents per ton if you are a domestic coming from North Carolina up here to New York. Those were the taxes. Now, and this was on July 4th in 1789. After that, on July 27th, we created the State Department, originally known as the Department of Foreign Affairs. Interestingly enough, though this was in July, Thomas Jefferson, who became our first Secretary of State, he was actually in France. He left in September, arrived home in November, and arrived home to the news that he was now going to be Secretary of State. And he was looking forward to going home to Monticello, to his idyllic pastime, where he envisioned everyone in America simply being a gentleman farmer, having a small plot of land, controlling the earth to bring forth a bountiful harvest that will nurture our country. What is wrong with that idea? Nothing. I never told him that. But that is only one very small part of it. We need credit. We need manufacturing. There is so much more that can be done than just being a country of farmers. On July 31st in 1789, there was a law for the regulation and the collection of duties on the tonnage of merchandise, which established the United States Customs Service and ports of entry. So very simply, if you're going to be bringing in your goods, we want to make sure that you go in through an official port of entry. So you can actually go to a port master and then go in and pay your customs duties. This was our first federal law enforcement agency that we created. But they were only on the land, not on the sea. On August 7th, about a week later, the Department of War was established. Henry Knox, who was a general during the Revolutionary War, was chosen to be our first Secretary of War. Now we call it Secretary of Defense. But even at that time, we realized that we did not want to have that position be a military position. The idea of a cabinet, what we have in America, was created by George Washington. And he wanted to have a civilian in control over the military, something that continues all the way to today, through our Secretary of Defense being a civilian. About a month later, on September 2nd in 1789, the Treasury Department was formed, and here is where I really started to come into my role. I was thinking about what type of country we can be, and I aimed high. I realized that trust is incredibly important, because when you trust someone, you're able to give them credit. And if you're able to give them credit, you're able to do business with them. And at the time, we had, for example, when I was a ship clerk back in St. Croix, when a ship came in, I would have my set of books, the ship captain would bring his set of books, we would do our account, I would take his sheep, I would give him Madeira or whatnot, and then his book would go to New York and then eventually to London, where it would be coinciding with their official books, and my books would have to go eventually to New York, over to South Street Seaport, which is actually Beekman Wharf, as I worked at the Beekman and Kruger trading firm. So if there was a zero out of place, or the decimal point was misplaced, you would stop that money would be placed on hold, and it would take months, if not years, to figure out a correct recollection of accounts. So having trust is incredibly important in my time. And so I wanted to pay back every single dollar that the federal government borrowed, dollar for dollar. There were many people saying, just discount it, pay 10 cents on the dollar, don't worry about it, that's all it's been worth for the entirety since it's been issued. It's been devaluing itself. I said no. And whoever had the last script is the owner of the script, and we paid them back dollar for dollar. And there was a $75 million debt at that time. Now that debt I consider to be the price of our liberty. I wore it as a badge of honor. I actually went on to take that debt and say, well, if you trust us to pay this back, then I will take that trust and monetize it by selling bonds at 6%. To which there was such a uproar that the price that was set by myself at $25 eventually hit a fever price of about $300, creating the first stock market bubble. But that is 1792, and 2 years after the scope of this talk. But you don't really hear about that stock market bubble because of my endeavors. More, you have to research that on your own. On September 24th, in 1789, the Judiciary Act, which created the Supreme Court, which had 6 Supreme Court justices at the time, as well the Attorney General. The very next day, the Bill of Rights, which at that time had 12 proposed amendments, they were sent to the states for ratification. 10 of those were ratified quickly, becoming the Bill of Rights. It's interesting to note that 5 of those 10 rights in the Bill of Rights actually have to do with the judiciary. So we were not only worried that a ruler can become a tyrant and take away our rights, but we were also thinking the courts can do just the same thing. So we wanted to enshrine our personal rights against the court. During the second session, things started to become alive, because we had our very first State of the Union address, with George Washington taking such a commanding position in inspiring the Senate and House of Representatives in order to do better, in order to think not only about the practical solutions, but think about what will happen in a century or a millennia for now. He asked them to think about the arts. He asked them to think about literature. He asked them to think about industry. And Congress listened. Now that was on January 8th. I followed him the very next day, on January 9th, where I gave my report on public credit. In this, I laid out my idea about how America can truly rise itself as a secure nation on equal footing to the grand nations of Europe. Though it was given, the information was given to Congress, it took a long time for me to actually enact some of these acts. On March 1st, in 1790, the Congress got back to their legislative session and made a provision for the first census, which is actually quite interesting because there were about 3 million people in 1790, and in 1800, 5.3 million people. That's a pretty good rate of people immigrating to America. And so with these people coming to America, the very next act that we create is the Naturalization Act, which simply stated that people had to be in the country for 2 years before you could become a citizen. And then the Patent Act followed in April, as well as the Copyright Act. So if we are a great country of innovation, those innovations need protection. We need those innovators to actually be able to have a solid foundation to use that innovation in society. And the Copyright Act, as well as the Patent Act of 1790, did just such. The Crimes Act was also passed in that month, delineating the first 33 federal crimes and punishments for said crimes. On June 20th, well, actually in May, I was having difficulties. All of my plans I wrote out, I created laws, I worked with congressmen, but none of them were even allowed to go to debate. Here I am, smartest man in the entire country, giving them exactly what they want to be this great country, and they won't even debate it. The problem? My old friend, James Madison. Once Thomas Jefferson came home, that Virginian, those two Virginians got together, and Thomas Jefferson totally swayed James Madison against me. And he was the Speaker of the House of Representatives at that time. But in a state of disarray coming out of George Washington's, now President Washington's house, which is down on Broadway, called the Macomb House, Thomas Jefferson said, let me bring you and Mr. Madison together and let's work this out. The idea of the federal city was still in the minds, and there were still a lot of plans and a lot of land speculation going on with all of these plans, because all these gentlemen were trying to buy land next to where the new federal city is going to be, but where is it going to be? And so the grand bargain was made. If James Madison simply does not strenuously object, he doesn't have to agree, but as long as he lets it come to a vote for the assumption of the state debts into the federal government, so it becomes federal debt, then I will put my weight behind moving the capital down to the Potomac, their chosen location. And the agreement among gentlemen worked. For after that dinner, the next month, the House approved technically, they approved the Susquehanna River site back in 1797, the Senate site of the Delaware River. That's why the House and the Senate just did not agree, but it would have been one of those two if they could have agreed just the year prior. But on July 16th, the Residence Act was officially signed into law, establishing Washington, D.C. as the site of our federal government. Then Pierre Charles L'Enfant, the man who turned Old City Hall into Federal Hall, was now commissioned to build or to design the federal city. And during the 10 years of its construction, the capital will be moved from here back to Philadelphia. 2 weeks later, the Indian Intercourse Act was passed, which regulated commerce between us and the Indian tribes. And then my acts, my side of the Great Compromise of 1790 started to come into play. The Funding Act of 1790, which authorized the full assumption of state debts by the federal government, it was passed. On that same day, the collection of duties for a revenue cutter service was passed. So this was what you now call the Coast Guard. Because we did not have a personal income tax at the time. All of the federal government monies, the vast majority of it was collected via tariffs. But if a ship simply just wanted to bypass a port and go to a very small town and offload goods, what's to stop them? So I actually remember my days back in St. Croix when I was working at the shipping firm, and all the very strong captains that were there. And these captains are opportunists. They will easily become privateers during the war. They know how to smuggle. We started our country on smuggling. John Hancock was the biggest smuggler in New England, so proclaimed by his signature on the Declaration of Independence. But nonetheless, I realized that if I hire these former smugglers to be the police on the seas, then they can actually stop smuggling, and it worked. Now, of course, Thomas Jefferson did not like this at all. He only had 6 people working for him in the State Department. I now had about 200 employees because most of them were in the cutter service. And finally, the Tariff Act of 1790, the very next year, where my tariff that I worked with James Madison in 1789 was good and based on weight, we expanded upon it. Yes, it comes as no surprise to you that they continue to change the tax code again and again and again. Never deleting anything, just always adding to it. And that's exactly what we did. At the time, I figured that we needed $3 million a year to function. Coincidentally, there's about 3 million people in the country. So the federal government should operate on about $1 per person per year. I think you've gone up. I think the country's spending more on you than it did on me. And we needed 75 million in order to eventually pay this all off. But I'm so happy that James Madison was able to find reason in my arguments as the same reason that he used with the Federalist Papers, and we were able to join together in this building at this spot in Federal Hall in order to create America on a sound financial, credit, military, and legal footing. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll open it up to questions about anything from my life. Yes?
Why was there so much animosity between you and Burr? I mean, he had different perspectives, and we touched on the fact that, you know, he had maybe different ethics than you.
Yes.
I mean, how did it all escalate and get to where it did?
Well, the difference is, use the word ethics, principles. That is what he lacked. He confided to me, as we were lawyers often riding the circuit together, he considered politics to be a most profitable profession. It piques my ear when I hear things about this. And when he betrayed my trust as I supported his water company in 1799, a little bit later from this, he betrayed my trust. And then he also ran against my father-in-law, Philip Schuyler, for a Senate seat in New York, where he flipped political parties. So he has no ethos. He has no morals. He will do whatever it takes for power, which is in stark contrast to a man like George Washington. But it goes on. After that, when he was on the ticket to be for the Anti-Federalist or the Democratic Republican Party during the election of 1800, at the time, according to the Constitution, each elector was given 2 votes. You had to vote for 2 different people, and you had to vote from someone who was not from your state. One could be from your state, and the other one had to go for someone else. The person with the most electoral college votes would be president. The second most votes would be vice president. So we changed that, because right now you would have President Biden and Vice President Trump. You could see how it's maybe not the best system, and that's what we were quickly realizing ourselves as well. Aaron Burr knew that Jefferson was going to be president, but when he realized that upon tying with Jefferson, because someone forgot to change their vote, they worked it out ahead of time, he realized he had a legal right to be president just the same as Thomas Jefferson. And he pushed that. He didn't have to, but he pushed it. So the tie went to the House of Representatives, and they voted about 33 times, and again, always a tie. So then I step in. And this is happening in Philadelphia. I step in and I push my weight behind Thomas Jefferson. Though I completely disagree with Thomas Jefferson in almost every position possible, I believe that he is honestly working for what he believes the best outcome for America. He's not working for the best outcome for himself. I was smart enough to realize that that is a poor choice. And so, with my support behind Jefferson, he lost. Once he lost, of course, he went to become vice president under Thomas Jefferson, to which Thomas Jefferson did not give him time of day since he ran against him. And so a lot of the time, instead of being down in Washington, D.C., Vice President Burr was actually here in New York. He really had very little to do, except when it was mandatory to go down to be president of the Senate for tie-breaking votes. And so what I failed to realize was how far he had fallen. I failed to realize that at the moment, and that was my fault. Because after that, I then piled on to him. He then he ran for another office, and I put my full weight against him. At this time, it's almost becoming habit. But with that, from his point of view, that really encapsulated his anger towards me. And so there was a court case actually up in Albany at the time. And this was in 1804 now. The court case actually had to do with Thomas Jefferson. I can go into great detail, but very simply, at a dinner, I said some things about his policies. A man who was at that dinner recounted in the newspaper what I said, and then added that he can tell more, he can relate a more despicable account of what I said. He didn't say it, he didn't put it in paper, but he said he could put in a more despicable account. Aaron Burr cut that out of the newspaper, sent it to my house, and basically said, "So, what other despicable things do you have to say about me in public?" To which I basically said, "I'm sorry, I did not say anything that is untrue." This did not satisfy him at all. He then retorted with a demand that I recount, or basically put it in the public papers, that I recount what I said about him. And I simply said, I cannot honestly do that. And I cannot go against my feelings. But then again, what is despicable? So I tried to get him on an equal footing of lawyers as we debate what despicable is. And is it really necessary? Can't you see that you are sometimes can be perceived as despicable? He didn't fall for it. So the end result, it ended up fighting into a duel. I was actually in about 10 affairs of honor, either as the primary or secondary, even once with future President James Monroe, over the leaking of the Reynolds affair to the newspapers. But nonetheless, with this accounting, then it became to a head, and we went across the Hudson River to the plains of Weehawken, where we had our fateful duel. On that duel, though, I'd like to give you a little bit of insight, because it really is quite a remarkable event. This is the sitting Vice President of the United States committing an illegal act. Dueling is illegal. Now, we actually found a spot over on the plains of Weehawken where it's on the ground next to a palisade, because that's America's only fjord that we have. And the farmer that owns the land, he can't actually see us, so he has plausible deniability. When we go there, no one is watching, but everyone turns their back again. We are committing an illegal act. But I realize that there's only so many outcomes. Most of the time, just showing up and saying that, proving that you're willing to die for your honor, is enough. It can be reconciled through our seconds, or we throw away our shots. We used to throw away our shots into the ground by just firing into the ground. But there's an actual book that is revised periodically over in Scotland where they tell us the rules for conducting duels, the Code Duelli. And they actually stopped that. They said, no, stop doing that, because seconds were getting killed from the ricochet. Fine. So the book now says fire up in the air. And so there was a legal case after this, because Aaron Burr did kill Alexander Hamilton. So the legal case and everything came out. So they realized that I did put on my spectacles. They realized that I did sight my gun. They did then realize that the guns that were used belonged to my wife's sister's husband, basically Angelica's husband, Mr. Church. Those were the same guns that were used 3 years prior by my son Philip, my eldest son. Still, in the thinking of English law, your eldest son gets everything. He was my everything. And he died in that duel, killed with the gun that I'm holding in my hand, or by the one that's about to be pointed towards me. Now, with all that in mind, I did write letters the night before, saying that I intend not to fire. Because if he gets shot and dies, well, he's the protagonist. He had it coming. Easy to see. I didn't want to fight, but he demanded satisfaction. If both of us do not fire, again, satisfaction. If both of us shoot and kill each other, that rarely happens. But the possibility that I could die. So if I did die, and these letters that I wrote the night before as I'm settling all of my accounts, realizing I could die, I need to tell my creditors how they're going to be paid. Those letters would come and did come to light during the court case. And so upon hearing that, oh, Mr. Hamilton did not even intend to fire, Mr. Burr was really excommunicated from polite society after that. Now, whether or not I did intend to fire, it is hard for me to say. Though my gun did go in this angle, as it was coming down, it did shoot over his head and hit a branch that fell behind him, as recounted in court by our seconds. And his shot held steadily on me. Now, whether or not Mr. Burr fired early, I do not want to definitively say as Alexander Hamilton. But I would say that it is in line with his character to fire early. But that is what I did in the upcoming to this, and eventually I got my revenge on him. Thank you for the question. Any other questions? I promise the answer will be less. Well, thank you for coming. Please enjoy the rest of Federal Hall and have a glorious Independence Day.